Welcome to the debate. Today, we're tackling something you can see it in almost any major city in the world. It's this persistent critique of our modern built environment, the crisis of residence. We're watching this global proliferation of standardized, generic buildings, the minimalist glass boxes that critics argue have just profoundly lost their connection to human scale, to emotional experience, and to cultural context. So the central question for us is pretty stark. Is the dominance of this kind of spectacle-driven architecture an inevitable, maybe even a necessary consequence of global capital inefficiency? Or does it represent a fundamental ethical and philosophical failure, a loss of soul, so to speak? My position today is that the modern paradigm is, for the most part, a rational and functional response to the very real economic and technical mandates that architects have to operate within.
And I'm coming at this from a completely different angle. I'd argue this model is absolutely an ethical failure. We are architects looking at cities worldwide, and what we see is a systematic failure to meet fundamental human psychological and cultural needs. And this results in, widespread alienation and disconnection. Even when these spaces look, on paper, clean or premium in some developer's brochure. I just don't buy the necessity argument when the global result is an architecture that so often feels placeless and frankly profoundly unsettling to the people who are forced to live and work in it.
Okay, but I have to push back on that framing. Your focus on personal feeling seems to completely overlook the overwhelming financial and structural demands that dictate the built environment today. I mean, this prevalence of standardization is really the logical conclusion of modernism's early promise, an embrace of industrialization to serve an increasingly mobile global population. Architecture has become, I think we have to admit, undeniably subservient to the capitalist economy. Design now acts primarily as a means to an extrinsic end, specifically luring consumers and maximizing profit.
And that is the tragedy. Architecture isn't meant to be a subservient tool of capital. It's meant to create environments for human flourishing.
But if the structure is the product, it has to be branded. The reality today is that the iconic, spectacular design, what some call the aesthetic supplement, is necessary for commercial success. And by aesthetic supplement, I mean those iconic design elements, the exaggerated curves, the unusual cantilevers, the visual sugarcoating that's needed specifically for corporate branding. A building silhouette today, it functions as a logo. It's a raw advertisement for a city or a company. Efficiency mandates and technical complexity ensure standardization wins over labor-intensive, bespoke craft every single time. It's a simple, if a bit harsh, equation. Form follows finance.
That kind of economic determinism just sacrifices everything that's meaningful about inhabiting a place. The prevailing aesthetic, that homogeneous, minimalist severity we see everywhere, is a rigid, ideological inheritance. It's rooted in these reductionist modernist principles that just fundamentally misjudged human emotional and cultural needs. And since the built environment is ubiquitous, it's inescapable, imposing standardized structures that the public finds ugly, unsettling, or devoid of cultural memory, it feels fundamentally oppressive. We're replacing storytelling and human scale with cold, abstract geometry.
Oppressive is pretty strong language for a facade, isn't it?
But the built environment profoundly shapes our thoughts and our emotions. It has immense affective capacity. So if we build environments that are just generic containers, we deny the community its history. And often, this whole approach prioritizes the architect's ego, this search for novelty's sake, over the community's need for identity and familiarity. The outcome is what we call the architecture of nowhere. So the core ethical challenge is creating environments where people can actually dwell and feel at home, rather than just being passive, alienated spectators of a spectacle designed for a photograph.
All right, let's go directly to that idea of spectacle because it seems central to your critique. You're framing it as inherently alienating, focusing on this triumph of look that's driven by marketing and photography.
Precisely. The contemporary critique really highlights how these spectacular designs reduced complex three-dimensional environments to a simple two-dimensional image, the Instagram photo, the website banner. These buildings are conceived almost as frozen computer games. The eye is engaged by all the dazzle, sure, but the body and the senses are not. Think about structures like the London City Hall. Formally, they're aloof. They just sit there, isolated in a sanitized world of glass and gray granite. Architecture should be a thing to be lived, not just looked at or consumed as an image. When we design for the image, we pull the building away from its rootedness in the community. The question becomes, are we designing for humans or are we designing for Instagram likes?
I acknowledge that architecture is increasingly seen as a commodity, but that doesn't just negate its cultural function. Yes, we see entities like the Guggenheim franchising itself globally, using architecture for market share and tourism dollars. But I'd argue that this spectacle can function as a really critical form of cultural signifier. Buildings that you might criticize for being mere sculpture, like those by Frank Gehry, become highly visible, usable sculpture. That spectacle is often the pathway to drawing resources, attention, and identity to a city.
But does a cultural signifier always equal human resonance? I mean, isn't it possible for a building to be an iconic signifier for tourists, but completely alienating for the people who live next to it? When we analyze Gary's design in Seattle, for example, critics noted this really jarring split between the dazzling, colorful exterior, the image, the mirage, and the often poorly resolved, ad hoc, kind of banged together backstage character of the interior spaces. This huge chasm between the stunning facade and the lack of human substance inside suggests a deep failure to deliver substance alongside the spectacular image.
That may be true in some cases, but focusing only on Gurry's interior issues risks overlooking a larger point. Abstract, high-concept architecture, even if it was originally imposing or power-laden, it can be appropriated and transformed by citizens into something beautiful and liberating over time. Think about the public appropriation of structures in Brasilia, which was famously modernist and abstract. People inject human life and meaning into the formal spaces they're given. The initial spectacular form is not the final word on its human value.
But that transformation happens despite the initial imposition and abstraction, not because the initial design was inherently sensitive to human scale.
Okay, but if we accept that spectacle is an economic necessity for identity, the next question is how those signature buildings are even physically created at speed. And that brings us right to standardization. You criticize the generic architecture of nowhere, but we have to be pragmatic about construction at a global scale.
We must.
I defend standardization based on the functional and cost benefits of contemporary, universally available materials: steel, glass, engineered wood, combined with advanced construction techniques. We use BIM now, building information modeling, which is, it's essential for coordinating massive, complex projects, ensuring efficiency and minimizing waste.
Efficiency, yes, but at what cost to authenticity? When I think about the loss of quality, I remember the level of care traditional builders used to take, like the necessity of clean cotton gloves for a carpenter handling delicate redwood boards. We've replaced that kind of reverence for material and place with the sheer speed of click and assemble BIM modeling. The feeling of disconnection is precisely because the design is intentionally divorced from local material history and culture. We lose tectonic expression, the visual articulation of how a building is actually put together, how it resists gravity, and how it uses materials truthfully.
While that level of craft is evocative, it is simply impossibly costly to scale for urban necessity today. Standardization is the key to scale and affordability. The push for contemporary materials is also driven by long-term performance and sustainability. Engineered wood makes efficient use of scarce resources, and modern steel offers undeniable strength and stability, even if we have to manage complexities like thermal bridging. The fiscal reality demands standardization if we are serious about addressing housing and infrastructure needs globally.
That's a compelling point, but I would frame it differently. The crisis of resonance isn't solved by reverting to some historical pastiche, but by finding new ways to integrate. We have models that demonstrate technical efficiency can coexist with local soul. Look at the concept of critical regionalism. This movement explicitly marries the universal technological power of modernism with site-specific, regional strategies.
Okay, tell us a bit more about that. How does critical regionalism bridge this gap effectively?
Well, look at the work of Glenn Murcutt in Australia. He didn't just add a thatched roof. He analyzed the intense sun path, the specific wind patterns, and he adapted Aboriginal shading and ventilation techniques for contemporary houses. He is using high-tech modern structure, but it's rooted entirely in the physical and cultural geography of the place. That's how you achieve authenticity and differentiation. The ability to just transplant a design anywhere without problems. The defining characteristic of the glass box is, in my view, actually a sign of an unsuccessful design. Design should respond, not impose.
Which brings us to the critical final point, which is really about agency. Who are we designing for? When we talk about alienation and disconnection, who holds the power in the design process?
It serves the developer, the capital, and, let's be honest, often the star architect's ego, but it rarely serves the user. The alienation stems directly from an anti-democratic, top-down process where design is unilaterally imposed upon people. We need to shift away from old social engineering mindsets towards social sustainability. This concept is all about ensuring the design process itself maximizes equity and well-being, which requires incorporating genuine user input and stakeholder agency.
But how do you implement true participatory design or co-design at the necessary urban scale without just crippling projects financially?
We have to find a way. There are case studies using participatory design methods that show architects can successfully work alongside architectural laypeople to help them communicate their desires, moving past technical jargon and focusing on the affective needs of the space, the concept of atmosphere. When designers actively negotiate what a space feels like, not just what it looks like, we get the design right the first time. This ultimately saves time and money and leads to happier users and even less vandalism. Ignoring the user isn't just bad ethics, it's bad business.
I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning for addressing systemic urban issues. Participatory design too often results in tokenism on the ladder of citizen participation, where the outcomes are superficial and the financial challenges are very real. I believe the far greater failure of modern architecture, the one that profoundly reinforces social inequality, is not primarily aesthetic or conversational. It's structural. I'm referring to the issue of architectural exclusion.
Explain what you mean by exclusion in this context.
I mean, that infrastructure and the built environment are often deliberately designed to actively restrict access based on class or race, reinforcing social inequality in profound ways that a soulless glass box never could. The subtle yet devastating use of architecture to maintain social control, that is the primary ethical failure of our field. The deliberate siting of transit stops, the creation of physical barriers, the use of zoning. These are regulatory mechanisms designed to perpetuate segregation. The paradigmatic historical example, which remains relevant today, is Robert Moses's construction of low bridges leading to Long Island beaches. Those bridges were explicitly designed to prevent 12-foot tall buses, often used by lower income groups and racial minorities, from accessing certain public parks.
Right. That's an undeniable and horrific manipulation of the built form.
And it is an ongoing reality. This problem, this hidden discrimination embedded in our roads, bridges, and zoning that regulates who belongs where, requires consequential structural action. Focusing purely on whether a glass box feels soulless distracts us from this systemic, often invisible discrimination. And this requires legislative and judicial solutions, like modifying environmental review statutes to address architectural exclusion directly.
You present a powerful case for the political work architects must prioritize, but I maintain that the two issues are linked. The systemic prioritization of form over feeling is part of the same ethical failure that allows us to ignore human consequence. Whether it's the alienation felt in a placeless office park or the literal physical exclusion enforced by a low bridge. If architecture is to avoid defuturing, which is the negation of environmental and cultural sustainability, it must prioritize human needs, collective ownership, and the hard,
uncomfortable work of real transformation rooted in context, rather than the momentary allure of the Instagram-ready image or the cold efficiency of capital.
And I would conclude that architects must operate within the current constraints of global capital and technology. While the pursuit of spectacle and efficiency can be coarse, focusing solely on the soul of a building risks marginality in the face of immense, immediate needs for shelter and infrastructure. The most consequential political action for architects should be addressing systemic social exclusion embedded in our infrastructure, rather than waging a perpetual style war against clean lines and modular construction.
I suppose ultimately we're left grappling with this tension between the universal values of modernism, efficiency, standardization, technological progress, and the profound local needs of dwelling, of cultural memory and human resonance. It's a balance we have yet to truly master in our globalized world.